Hello friends, this is Growl. I've gotten lots of requests to do more dungeon review videos, specifically talking about mechanics and ways that you can optimize your dungeon runs. So I decided to do my next one as a 25 siege that we did. In hindsight, maybe this wasn't the best option because Alliance Siege and Horde Siege, if you didn't know, are slightly different in the beginning. But I thought this would be a good next video to review because this was always my toughest dungeon, and I struggled with this one a lot when I was coming up as a healer. I remember if there's any dungeon where I depleted it for my team, it was this one. This was a very frustrating one for me as a healer, so I thought it would be a good one to go over it. One thing about Siege is that there aren't a lot of very difficult healing encounters. A lot of the things that happen in this dungeon are DPS checks, so this is a dungeon where I tend to run a little bit higher of a damage build. You can see that I'm running 35% haste and 21% mastery. This is before the Expedient Corruption vendor came out, so my haste will probably be much higher then, but my mastery was pretty low. So one thing about this dungeon is that almost every single mob in the dungeon has a frontal, so it's very important to always be behind mobs and be paying attention to where your tank is. Unfortunately, at this time, my teammates have decided it's a great idea to transmog themselves into giant crushers, so my visibility here is a bit limited. But I would recommend, if you were playing this dungeon, to not be transmogrified as giant crushers. We tend to skip these packs in the beginning as they are a little bit slower. These footmen aren't great count, and the marksman can actually be kind of dangerous. So we opt to shroud all of this, but in a pug, this may not be a bad idea. A very important mechanic in Horde Siege is these Scrimshaw gutters. So what happens here is the gutters and the footmen are fighting as sort of a roleplay event that goes on. If you tag the footman or get in combat with the footman, it'll immediately cut the gutter and kill it. However, the gutter is actually worth count, so it's a good idea to hit the gutter with an ability before you get in combat with the footman. If you're playing in a pug, I would recommend as a healer moonfiring one by one every single gutter before any of your teammates get to them, because you might not be able to trust that they're going to tag them all. In a coordinated group setting like we have specific people that are always tagging gutters. Usually it's the mage and the tank. However, this is something that in pugs I did a lot as a healer. I would manually tag every single gutter by myself. One thing to note about the footmen that are fighting the gutter is they have two very important abilities. One, they flee when they get low, in combination with an ability called Hindering Cut, which does a ton of damage and gives you a haste reduction when it hits you, and it'll hit whatever the nearest target is. Even if it has threat on the tank, it can still hit a melee or a healer. So you want to make sure that when the footmen are fleeing, you are not near them. It's something that you don't quite notice if you're just watching, but I wanted to point out because that'll be something that happens often in pugs, is that the footmen start fleeing, and if they run at you, when they stop fleeing and run back towards the tank, they're going to cut you on the way there. We have a little bit of a mishap here. I kind of forgot this happened. Our tank died to the tank buster. This was, I think, maybe 14 or 15 hours into a key session, so it happens. So you can see here our tank is tagging those gutters, as I mentioned, while I'm getting some hots up on the team. These footmen do a lot of damage. You can see even with every hot and Iron Bark and Bark Skin, they took them below half. That's sort of why we had that little setup time there. And you can also see the footmen fleeing. It's a good idea to use Vortex here. We have a Guardian Druid, so we can use 2 of them on each pack, but it's generally a good idea to use Vortex so that they don't flee into your teammates. So one thing that we do here is that when the bursting is going out, we stun the marksman we make sure that people save stuns like Gouge and BTE from the rogue so that the marksman can't be shooting us when bursting is going on. This is a lot of people ask me, okay, you do lots of these things as a healer, what can I do as a DPS that help my team? That's a really, really good thing that you can do, is stopping that random damage from the marksman while bursting is going on. And it's a pretty common occurrence. There are lots of packs like this. Here's another one, another pack that has a marksman and some footmen. You can see I dropped my vortex there. Another thing you can do, if you look where Chow, the Iron-Tide Crusher, is there, you can actually walk behind this wall to line of sight the marksman shots. So if your team isn't able to stop them and you just want to stop them yourselves, then you can just go behind that wall every time. You can see I do it right here. I see the notification that Molten Slug is on me and I run behind the wall, specifically because I notice our Demon Hunter dies. So I think, okay, well, we're not going to have that many stops right now because one of our melees is dead. Also, the pull is going to last a little bit longer. You can see here I do it again. When the slug is on me, I walk behind the wall. It's just for safety, because as you get into really high keys, those slugs are going to hurt really bad. One thing to note is that this boss isn't very healing intensive, so you don't have to worry about getting mana or anything going into this boss. This boss slightly differs between depending on Horde or Alliance, but the only one I know how to play is Horde, so this is the one I'm going to talk about. So what happens is he fixates on a player. Generally, it's very often you. It's always you. It goes on ranged players. Then 3 bombs spawn. So these first 3 circles, the ones that are empty, so you can see one under my frames right here, one right here, and then another one over here, this empty one. These will be where the bombs spawn that you need to run the boss into. So you want to be looking, if you notice the way my camera's positioned, it's up top, and it's also so I can see a huge portion of the boss fight room. That way I'll know quickly where the bombs are so I can get the boss there. You can see that at this point I only have 8 seconds left for the fixate before the boss will do his little grapple thing. And so it's really important on this very first bomb that you recognize where the bombs spawn and you get the boss to them. So I got very fortunate with that spawn and I brought it in there. One thing is, after the boss takes one of these bombs, it takes 50% increased damage for 6 seconds, I believe. So it's a good idea to save any damage that you have for this moment right here. So you can see I have my claw trinket as well as my crucible charges saved up, and hopefully you'll see me use those. Yeah. So anytime you have extra damage, it can be a good idea to save up combo points for bite as well. You can see that time it was fixated on our mage. So you can see right away, before the fixate is even started, I've already looking to see where the bomb is and I'm moving towards the bomb. So even though it wasn't on me, I don't want to be put in a situation where I'm like panicking and I don't know where the bomb is. I'm always trying to think a step ahead on this boss. So another thing that can happen, this isn't quite this situation, but if the bomb spawns very close to the wall and you are not sure if you can live, you want to use your defensives on yourself, because sometimes the boss can melee you. Again, this isn't a situation of it, but I wanted to mention it because it's important. You generally want to save both bark skin and iron bark for this fight in case you have to drag the boss into a wall. It may hit you, and on high keys it's just going to one-shot you with its melee abilities. It doesn't happen here generally, but it happens on the very north side of my screen where this marksman is CC'd. You can often get bombs like very close to this wall here that you have to essentially face tank the boss for a hit to get it to fixate. So this is the 4th fixate, and because there is only 3 bombs, the boss is always going to unless you time it, I shouldn't say always, you can get lucky with the way that the bombs spawn and you can get that 4th fixate into a bomb, but in general, this 4th fixate you're gonna have to run in. So what happens when the fixate ends, if you haven't brought it to a bomb, is the boss is going to chain you if you're being fixated. In order to break the chain, you actually have to run to the boss. I notice a lot of healers, when they aren't familiar with this mechanic, they keep running away from the chain, but the chain is going to do damage and keep you silenced. So unless it's a really low key level or you have a ton of hots and defensives up, you're just going to die to the chain because you can't heal. So what you want to do is run the chain in to break it and then run out so that you don't get hit by the ground effect. We actually do a nice trick where our mage invises the fixate. That way he doesn't do the chain and he just now he's on to his 5th fixate, which is on me. You can see right away here is where I realize I need to turn the boss around to get to this bomb. So I press my sprint. Sprint is a good way if you need to do a 180 around the boss. So I try and save that for that specific situation. And if you are using your DPS cooldowns on the boss properly when the bombs are going off, then usually it should die by the 4th or 5th fixate around this time. If you're getting really good when you're doing, let's say, 19 keys and 20 keys, you can have the boss dead in the first 3 bombs. So right away, these Marauders have a ability that does a bunch of initial damage and also puts a dot that's arcane damage. So most tanks get hurt really hard by this if they're not ready for it, because it's actually magic damage and it's not physical damage. That's these Irontide Marauders. So this is a pull where you can see we use a lot of defensives as well. Our tank uses Bark Skin, I use Iron Bark, and he uses the N'Zoth Trinket, the Psych Shell. This is a pull that if you're not ready for, will just immediately kill your tank. And as a healer who's been in this dungeon a few times, you may be ready for that. Again, this is a situation where there are the marksmen that are shooting with the bursting stacks, so we're having people stun those. We can see our Demon Hunter also drops darkness for that. There's not really many tough healing pulls, so you generally want to be using all of your big cooldowns for bursting, so you don't get killed by the Marauders. You can see that was one cut right there that brought our tank to half health. But you can't Iron Bark every single pull. This commander generally likes to trample at ranged, so as a healer, I try and position myself in a way that it's going to trample away from the melee. So you see that the melee are standing over here, and you can see where I'm standing, so that even if the melee aren't paying attention, I aim the trample away from them. You can think about it as 2 ways. You can yell at people for getting hit by trample, or you can just do your best to face it. So this is another pull with Marauders. You can see we do the exact same thing again. I Iron Bark, he uses his N'Zoth Trinket. I want to rewind this slightly if I didn't get this. So I mentioned how you have to tag the gutters that are fighting the footmen in order to get count from them. So there's this weird RP thing going on across this water that has 4 footmen and 4 gutters, and you can actually tag all of these gutters and get a free 4 count from them. I generally try and do it early here because you get stuck in combat with them a little bit, so if you wait till the end of the pull, you will not be able to enter the obelisk. So what I do is, if you have the High Noon trait that increases Sunfire range, you can tag these 2 specific gutters that I tag. Here's number 1, the far right one, and number 2, the far left one, and this will actually hit all 4 of the gutters with Sunfire. If you do not have the High Noon trait, you do need to do it a different way. I always have the High Noon trait, but I remember one time I had the wrong gear set up and I actually got stuck in combat or something with those guys because it didn't Sunfire all 4 of them. This kick ad can be a little bit frustrating because the corridor that you have here for moving them is so small. So be sure to be willing to use these posts as line of sight for the casts if you need to. Since we paused a little bit, I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit just so this video doesn't get too long. There isn't too much damage at this part of the dungeon, so I use this to get a little bit of mana, because there can be, what happens is the spotter drops these artillery circles, and you can use that to help kill mobs, especially small health mobs, so that they die evenly with bursting. So what happens here is we end up dragging the spotter around for a couple minutes. So anytime we're about to reach a pull with one of these spotters, I try to take a break and make sure I recover a decent amount of mana so that I don't run out of mana while we're chaining together. This is another pull with Marauders, so you can see it. We do the same exact thing. I bark the tank uses Iron Bark. An important concept in this dungeon that I didn't quite mention, but it's important to keep in mind, is there's tons and tons of pulls with one mob that has a lot of health and lots of other mobs that have small health. So don't be focused too much on trying to do AoE damage. This is actually a dungeon where having single target priority damage is very, very valuable. You can see our tank is in charge of tagging all of those gutters there. There's actually, I believe, 6 or 7 of them in that pack, which again is all free count if you get those. As a healer, it can be hard to tag all of them. Normally, I just moonfire one by one all the gutters to make sure that I don't activate the combat of the footmen and get them killed. Because if the footman kills the gutter when you don't tag them, you don't receive the count for them. For some reason, our mage is still a crusher. He's a very corrupted crusher, though. So this is a pull with a lot of footmen. Again, you're watching where we position. I'm trying to stay far away from the footmen because they're going to cut. I use Vortex there again to keep them together so that they don't flee and cut people. Although this guy was very close to cutting me there. I don't know who the cut, or maybe it got dodged or something. So, as I mentioned previously with the blob, it's very important that you're not baiting the pools in front of your team. You can see where me and the mage stand very, very far away from everybody so that the tank has a clear path to bring the blob alongside each tentacles. And so now you can see the next place that I'm standing. I'm standing again far away, and the mage is kind of in the way there, I guess, a little bit, but we still have a clear path for the tank. You can make your tank's life a lot better and your melee's life a lot better on this guy. And actually, you can be doing more damage if you do this, because when you keep the path clear, you make it so your job healing is very easy, and you don't have to do much healing on this guy, and you can focus on damage as opposed to trying to heal everyone's puddles. You can see for a second there, I ran over to the mage to try and make sure there was a path on this bridge. And with combustion, we kill that guy in 50 seconds, which is pretty crazy for a 25. We use that to skip this pack right here before the bridge. You generally want to skip a couple of these really tough packs in the beginning and then get count later with the spotter. So this cannon guy has a frontal. All of these deckhands have a frontal. You have to be very careful here that you don't stand in front of these mobs. This is actually an area that I probably wouldn't recommend fighting these guys. Our tank does it for whatever reason, but this is like a really, really tough area to deal with frontals. You can see that I'm being very careful with the way I'm positioning my camera. I'm also not worrying about DPS at all. I'm never entering cat form during this because of all this nonsense that's going on. You can push more damage in cat form, but in a situation like this, it just becomes very risky when there are just tons of frontals going on. A lot of the deaths that you'll find in Siege are just people getting hit by the frontals and trying to greed for damage. Especially when you have one of the spotters, you barely need the damage. So here are more Marauders. We don't have my Iron Bark available. We used it on the last pull, so I'm being sure to keep all my hots on the tank and be ready to top them up if needed. So this boss is a timed phase boss, and the more damage that you can get during the down phases, the faster this boss will die. So sometimes it's a good idea to wait a few seconds. You see we timed out here so that our mage's combust is lined up right for this first little moment. That way we can get a full combustion before the boss reaches up there. One thing I like to do, this is not something that you'll likely see in pugs, but in higher level groups where you want to keep the spotter, I'd use my Typhoon and my Vortex to push it slowly off to the side. This brings the spotter out of range of our team. That way it isn't dropping bombs on them. And I also try and stay further away from my team so that if I get the bombs, I'm not being a nuisance to them. These guys have frontals, these deckhands, so you want to be not in front of these mobs. The way this works is, it's kind of hard to explain, but hopefully it makes sense. So there are 3 areas in this boss room that get painted every time it uses broadside. So the first it's random which order it's in for each intermission, but once you see the order, it's the same for that whole intermission. So you can see the swirlies are over here on this side. The best way to play this boss is to go to the side that's safe, or that's painted first, and find a safe spot, because you'll see what happens here. So first it's this side that's painted, then it's this side, now it's this side last, but the order that all these blow up is not the same as the order that they're painted. So it doesn't go 1 2 3 and then 1 2 3 in terms of when they blow up. It might go 1 2 3 then immediately blow up 3. And so you can see that one went middle, then mine, then the first side. So the safest way that you can play this boss in the intermission is to go on the side that is painted first and then find a safe spot there, as opposed to waiting in the open areas, because it's going to get painted with bombs eventually, and then you will have a lot less time to find a safe spot. With Wild Charge and being super ready for it, I end up staying on this side, but especially important if you're a tank, that it's a good idea to have the boss on one of the earlier sides. That way you can help your DPS players find a safe spot quickly, as opposed to... Oh, you can see I mess up my my Typhoon there. I used it a little bit too early when the guys rooted. This is something, again, that's not super important in pug groups, but you may find it in higher level groups, or especially bolstering, that you want to keep the spotter. It does hurt my damage a little bit. You can see I decided not to enter cat form because I'm going to be dropping bombs on my team. I'm sure they're good enough to dodge them, but I just try to make it a little bit easier for them. Another thing to note too is that the boss does take damage while she's phased, so it's a good idea to refresh all of your dots, all 4 of them, before she goes up. So for example, where most phase bosses, they'll go immune, so it's a good idea to just use like a bite or just auto attack, like use Solar Wrath instead of applying a dot, because it's just going to go off right away. But this boss actually takes dot damage when she's on the boat, so always refresh your dots before she goes up. If you take too long on the intermission, it spawns more ads. Generally, what we're doing is we save a ton of damage for the boss, so sometimes that can happen. It's usually not a terrible thing to have extra ads, as long as your tank can survive it. Classes like Rogue, or I guess Guardian Druid in a way, there are a lot of classes that actually benefit from having extra ads. Hunter is another class that if you have more ads with the boss, it'll actually do more damage to the boss, not just to the ads. So here, in order to make up from some of the count from the mobs that we skipped earlier, we bring the spotter over and kill these bilge rats. It's a good idea to keep the spotter away from these mobs. I kind of let it by me there because my root broke from damage, but ideally you want to keep the spotter a little bit further away. These guys do a lot of tank damage, so it's really important that you're juicing up the tank for these pulls. Almost all of these guys are tank damage, and on top of that, mobs are all the respawn point is really short, so if the DPS die, it's fine, they can just release, but if the tank dies, it can be a pretty catastrophic. So I want to rewind this. A lot of people I see run renewal in every dungeon, but I think not running wild charge and siege is a huge mistake. And part of the reason I hated siege for so long was because I didn't run wild charge. So as a healer, it can be a nightmare if you get selected by the bombs, because you have to bring the bombs in for your team. However, what you can do is simply just wild charge to your tank whenever you see the artillery. So you can see there, I immediately wild charge to the tank and I drop 2 bombs on top of the monkeys. and then I try and drop a third one. Wild Charge is like an absolute godsend here as a healer. I don't know if I could ever play this dungeon again without Wild Charge. It's just so good. It makes having the bombs on you being a nightmare to it's actually fine. So next is the Fear guy. I got asked a couple times about how I do dispels on the Fear guy. So the way I do it is if the debuff is on the tank while there are ads, I always dispel the tank unless there are unless they can immune it, like a warrior berserker rage or whatever. The reason is that the ads, the tear flesh dot hits really hard, and if the tank gets feared during that, they're gonna die. So you can see there's still ads, so I'm just continuously dispelling the tank. Then once the tank is stabilized and the little ads die, I start dispelling the DPS, because usually the tank is trying to move the boss anyway and not doing much damage. I try and watch my team's buffs. So for example, here I noticed that Psycho's in meta, so I decide to dispel Psycho because he's going to be doing the most damage to this guy. If no one has any big cooldowns up, I just usually dispel like the slowest class, like if we're playing with an Unholy DK or maybe a rogue. I guess it depends on the situation, but usually I just dispel slow classes so that they don't have to get feared away from the boss. Again, this is another situation where we're going to use the spotter, so I'm going to stay in the realm to make sure I get full mana. So to do this pack, these snipers are just insanely strong, and really the only way to do this pack on a high key is to crowd control all of them and just kill them with the bombs. You can see the way that I believe our rogue is doing it is the correct way. I see a lot of people standing on top of the snipers, but the problem is it drops 2 bombs and then you can't keep standing on them, right? So you want to make just remember back to the 4th grade when you had to make a Venn diagram. You want to make a Venn diagram with the snipers so that you can get all 4 of the bombs on them. You can see where I'm standing to. This is the spot that you want to stand. So an important thing to note about the snipers is they have 2 abilities. One is shoot and one is ricochet. Ricochet does much more damage than shoot, and so if you have some sort of stop as a DPS player or a stun, maybe war stomp or something, you generally want to be interrupting the ricochet and not the shoot, because the ricochet does much more damage. Once we get the spotter, we go into this room. We do have to do some more of the mobs before this guy, but it was maybe a bad patrol with the big crusher or whatever. So these guys have a few important abilities. These invaders have a poison that stacks up. You can see I'm tracking this poison on my frames, and usually it gets to about 4 or 5 stacks before I dispel it. You don't want to dispel right away on 1 stack because it's just going to get reapplied. The commander also does the trample that you've seen. This is an ability that in high keys will just immediately kill you, so you need to be very aware of tramples at all time. You see how I'm positioning down? I try and be consistent with where I position the trample so that it's always going in the same direction. That way it makes it just a little bit easier for my teammates to see, so they know every time. Like, I'm not standing up here by the lamppost or whatever, or I'm not standing on the bridge. I'm always standing in the same spot to make it easier for my team. So there's 3 pulls in here. One of them has 2 snipers. That's AoE damage, but most of the first 2 pulls that we do are with the commander and the invaders, which are mostly tank damage. So again, I'm just keeping track of the poison, making sure I dispel the poison when I can. There's not too much healing that goes on, so feel free to use. I just like to use my Innervate on cooldown, my Trank on cooldown, just any big spells that I need to use, because you can end up being in combat here for quite a long time. The commander not only has much more health than all the other mobs, but also doesn't get affected by the cannon. So all my damage in these pulls is going on the commander. The commander is going to live the longest, and I mentioned earlier in the video about priority damage being important in this dungeon, this is a very important scenario too. Now, don't even be worrying about any of these other mobs. You can see I'm just moonfiring, sunfiring the commander, using all my crucibles on the commander, because this is going to be like, every pull is going to look like this, where all the mobs are dead except for the one commander. So the time that it takes to kill all the other mobs doesn't mean anything. This is the last pull in the room. This is the snipers. This is the pull that will do a lot of AoE damage. You see me here using my wild charge again. It makes this a lot easier because I get, you know, if I wouldn't have had that wild charge, I may not have been able to get any of those bombs on them. I would have had to either not get bombs on them or stand in melee range the whole time. And neither one of those things is preferable for me. One thing you have to be careful about is pulling the boss in this room. If you pull the boss, every single mob left in the room gets aggroed and runs to you and will not get unaggroed even if you even if the boss resets. So be really careful while you're doing this room not to pull the boss if you don't want to. However, you can pull the boss if you want to pull all the mobs. So next we're doing all these bilge rats on the bottom. Again, this is a pack where having the spotter helps you a lot, even though it isn't raging or bolstering or anything. This is a very, very heavy tank damage pack. You can see I have every single hot in the game on my tank right now. He's also using bark. I use my bark. I'm not even worried too much about ramping for bursting. I put up a couple rejuves, but my main focus is on the tank. They have a very nasty, I think it's a disease. It's something that druids cannot remove. So if your tank gets it applied, they're going to hurt really bad. This is a pull where having a disease dispelling class can actually be pretty nice. You can see because we don't have barks, our tank uses survival instincts on pull there. All of these pulls are very nasty in terms of tank damage. Barely worrying at all about damage, just using Sunfire and focusing heals on the tank. You can see the disease that's on our tank right there. He's going to get hit really hard. Luckily, we killed the pack right as it got applied, but if he was still getting melee during that, he's very likely to die. So now that we have 100% count, we just have these two bosses left. This boss isn't particularly interesting, so in the effort of saving time, I'm going to skip over most of it. So just keep in mind that you see this break water go out. Don't get scared that your team is at low health. You don't need to rush to heal your team up for this. Generally, I just use an F-Flow and then a Wild Growth and then just get back into cat form. This boss can take a long time, especially with your teammates saving cooldowns, so don't be too scared. Like, you shouldn't be spending mana on this boss because all you need to do is just heal a little bit and all the natural like group healing will top everyone up. You can see that even with even though the party bars look really scary, I just pop a regrowth, or I pop a wild growth, I put a couple of rejuves out, and then I just go right back to cat form. There's no rush at all to top people up for this fight. That's pretty much it. There shouldn't be really any difficult parts about this boss as a healer. But I do want to skip ahead to the last boss. So I will talk about the mechanics of this boss because it's pretty important to understand if you're trying to do this, and if you're copying a higher ups group strategy, it may not work for you if you don't understand the intricacies of it. So what happens here is there are two tentacles on each platform. There's a demolishing and a gripping. The gripping is the one that you need to kill in order to free the dwarf to shoot the cannon and damage the boss. And there are 3 cannons that need to be shot. However, while you're attacking the gripping, more and more demolishings will spawn. You can see on the bottom left of my screen, there's a timer for 20 seconds when the next demolishing will spawn. On each platform, there are 5 demolishings that will spawn, for a total of 15. And that guy has 4 million health on a fortified key. So you're going to have to do like combined with the grippings, you're going to be doing 80 million damage to this boss if you try to kill all the demolishing. So what we do is we sync our burst damage cooldowns on the gripping before the demolishings can spawn. So on this first platform, you can see that here's our timer of when the next demo will spawn, and we're using a lot of cooldowns right here. We're using our Bloodlust, our Mage Combust, and I think we hold meta for this because meta is so long, but we know exactly what damage cooldowns we need to use. Let's rewind a little bit. So the boss puts out 2 debuffs on your allies. When you dispel these debuffs do a lot of damage. This is just the initial hit. When you dispel the debuff, it knocks everyone next to them away quickly. One small note is that when you use Rogue Cloak and maybe certain other abilities, it actually does not knock people away. So rogues do not have to walk away from everybody if they want to cloak it. Certain immunities do, certain don't. So you may have to experiment depending on the class that you play. So what I do, my general mindset for this boss is I watch as the debuffs go out and I see who I can dispel quickly. My whole goal is to find a person I can dispel quickly so that there's only 1 debuff. I'm not prioritizing who I dispel in terms of, oh, this person, it's easier to keep it on, let's keep it on the tank or whatever. I'm prioritizing speed of dispel. And so in this situation, I see that I'm far away and the mage is far away, so I'm going to dispel myself and the mage right away. In this situation, the rogue cloaked the second one, so only 1 debuff was needed to be dispelled. But you'll find situations later when we end up needing to use more. So here, now we have 2 demolishing terrors. At this point, the platform needs to be over very quickly because if you get 3, it's just a wipe. So we kill the gripping. You can see here that both melee players are affected by the putrid waters. So I can't dispel right away. I see our tank is further away. I can see our melee DPS are over here and our bear is over here, so I opt to dispel the bear first. I'm not worried about who it's on. I'm just trying to dispel as fast as I can so that I don't fall behind in dispels. As soon as you dispel one, you should just start stacking every single hot that you have on the other guy. You can generally use Swiftmen's Cenarion Ward on almost every single one. You can see again here, it was on the same 2 players. I saw that the bear was outside of everyone, so I just instantly dispelled him. And then as soon as I got that dispel out, I'm just spamming every hot on the next guy until I can dispel that one. So if you notice there, you can actually see the little water coming out from the boss. You can use this to get a heads up from a few seconds ahead to know where the debuff's coming on. You can also like use bark skin or whatever ahead of time too. So what we're doing here is we're actually waiting because we killed the gripping terror. I know the tentacles won't spawn, so we're actually just waiting for our mage combust to come back up for the next gripping, because we don't want to have to deal with these demolishers. So a mechanic that happens on the second platform and the third platform is that more demolishers will not start spawning until you engage the gripping. Why this happens, I don't quite know. You can see in the bottom left, there's no timer for the next demolisher. So the strategy with the second and third platform is get it as clean as possible, get all your cooldowns ready, and then go on to the gripping. So actually something interesting happens here, which we'll go over so that you can see exactly how it works. So we're fighting the demolisher, and here the debuff is about to come out. And I think it was my dispel. A player gets knocked into the gripping. So you can see here, in my view, it looks like everyone is spread out enough. So I dispel the demon hunter, but just as that happened, the rogue walked barely within range and gets knocked by the putrid waters. So if you watch here on my timers in the bottom left, the rogue is going flying towards the gripping, and now the demolishing terror timer has started. It started, and now we're on a timer to kill the gripping. If this had not happened with this dispel, we would have infinite time without the next demo spawning. But because this happened, we are on a timer now. So when that happened, I immediately let my team know there's no waiting. We have to rush now and kill this gripping. This is where we use a lot of our damage cooldowns. I think we use another combust, our demon hunter metas. This is where I use my claw and all my crucibles. I see, so again, right, I see the mage is over here, and I'm dispelling the mage first. Even though it's not super, like, the mage is in Lucid, so he doesn't really need the dispel yet. I'm just noticing that he's definitely safe, and I want to get my dispel on cooldown as fast as possible. Then I throw my bark and some hots on the demon hunter so that I can go back and do some cat damage real quick. So now you see the timer that we're on. We have 9 seconds until the next demolisher spawns, so we need to kill this gripping. But because we executed the strategy, there's only one demolisher. If anybody attacks or even goes in aggro range of that gripping, the timer is going to start. So that's why, even though we messed up a little bit when we aggroed it, we still aggroed it late enough so that only one demo spawns. And now we're going to end up doing the exact same thing that we did on the second platform, in that we are just going to chill here and save cooldowns. Again, I very often dispel the range players first because I'm watching where they're standing and I know they're likely safe. A small side note here is that I don't know if this has ever been fixed, but this boss can actually attack you. I don't know why. You can see it trying to do it here, but if you walk too close on this bridge, you can actually just get killed in one hit by the boss, which is absolutely ridiculous that it happens, but just watch out for that. So again, exact same strategy here. The range player and I are both spreading out. I'm dispelling us first. Our tank is facing the demolisher in a way that the frontal doesn't hit any of the DPS players. You do have to watch out on this specific tentacle because it may seem like the tank is always safe, but when the demolisher is using the slam, the tank actually has to sidestep it over here. So be careful not to dispel the tank when he is sidestepping. Or especially don't dispel the DPS while the tank is sidestepping and then knock the tank away from the tentacle. Again, same exact thing, dispelling the mage first, using my Cenarion Ward, everything on myself. I noticed that I'm a little bit too conservative with my cooldowns here. Or my shorter cooldowns. There's no reason not to use Swiftmend on every single one, but for some reason I noticed that I save it. I think that's a mistake. And I think that's it for the most part. So you can see here, I specifically instruct our rogue not to cloak because I want to have that cloak available when we're doing the damaging on the gripping. So now you see this situation, there's no timer. We could sit here for the rest of the dungeon and nothing will happen. It'll just keep putting out the debuffs. The timer for the gripping has not started, or the timer for the demo. And now as soon as we engage this gripping, now the timer starts. And now we have 20 seconds to kill the gripping. And this is on this platform, because it's the last one, we aren't worried about a timer as much because as soon as we shoot the cannon, the dungeon's over. So this is the one where we don't worry as much about not having cooldowns up. So that's why we use meta on the second platform and lust on the first one. Because as soon as this gripping is over and we shoot the cannon, we win. And you can use the dispel to knock your teammates into towards the chest spawner, towards the chest faster. That's a great time save. But I think that's it. I think that's mostly covered everything that happened in this siege, at least. I'm sure there's other things that I'm missing, but I hope that video helped you guys. I hope it made siege less of a suffer. If you enjoyed this key review, hopefully I'll put out more. Give me some suggestions as what dungeons or whatever that you want to see. Be sure to check out my stream, twitch.tv/yummytv. Thanks for watching. Happy keying, friends.